Snow fell like ashes from a silent sky, blanketing the town of Snowbridge in a shroud of white. A funeral bell tolled, its echo carried on the winter wind. Two little girls in pink sweaters clutched each other by the graveside, tears carving paths down their frozen cheeks. Their father, Silas Monroe, a soldier just returned from war, stopped dead in his tracks when he saw the face on the portrait, his wife, Clara. At his side, his loyal German shepherd, Valor, growled low, ears pinned toward the coffin. And then, before the ropes lowered it into the earth, the coffin lid trembled. Snowbridge, Colorado, was a town of iron winters and quiet silences, nestled against the shadow of the Rocky Mountains. The snow that fell here was never gentle. It came down thick and heavy, swallowing the rooftops and pressing against the narrow streets until the whole place looked as if it were being slowly erased by nature itself. That afternoon, the pale sky carried no sun, only a sheet of dim gray light that seemed to flatten the world. The church bell tolled, each strike a hollow reminder that something irreplaceable was being lowered into the earth. Against this backdrop of grief and ice, Silas Monroe returned. Silas was 40 years old, a career soldier whose life had been carved by both duty and silence. His frame was broad, shoulders thickened by years of carrying heavy packs through foreign deserts, but his eyes betrayed something different, the blue-gray of a man who had seen too much yet carried it quietly, a man weathered not just by war, but by longing. His beard was rough, shot through with early gray, and his hands were scarred, each mark telling of fights survived and battles where he had nearly been swallowed whole. He carried no medals on his chest that day, only a threadbare green coat with snow clinging to the hem and a small backpack slung over one arm. But at his side walked the companion who had never left him, Valor. Valor was a German shepherd, black and tan, with a body built of muscle and vigilance. His coat was thick, glistening against the snow, but it was his eyes that unsettled strangers. Amber bright, piercing, always alert. To Silas, though, those eyes were a lifeline, because Valor had once dragged him bleeding from a desert ambush when every other man had been cut down. Since then, the dog's loyalty was unshakable, and Silas often wondered if the animal could sense things beyond human sight, as though born with some tether to the unseen. That day, Valor's ears pricked, hackles rising as the sound of weeping carried on the wind. The dog tugged at the leash, pulling Silas toward the hilltop cemetery. The cemetery was old, its wrought iron gates leaning under the weight of snow, its rows of eucalyptus trees groaning under the frost. The path that led up to it was worn stone, half buried in ice, and lined with mourners whose coats flapped in the wind like black banners. They stood still, their heads bowed, hands clutching chrysanthemums whose petals had already begun to wilt in the cold. Silas's boots crunched on the snow, but no one turned to greet him. They were all staring ahead to the casket perched on its stone platform, ropes waiting to lower it into the grave. Then Silas frozen. On a wooden stand beside the coffin rested a portrait, framed in simple oak, and the face that stared back at him was one he had carried in his heart through every mile of deployment. Clara Monroe, his wife. Her eyes in the photograph were brown, gentle, framed by waves of dark hair she used to braid on Sundays when the world was still calm. But beneath the portrait, the inscription cut like a blade, "Beloved mother, beloved wife." The word deceased clung to the air like a lie written in stone. Silas's breath caught in his throat. He had letters from her, dated barely a month ago, filled with little sketches she used to tuck in the margins for the twins. She couldn't be gone. It wasn't possible. By the coffin, two little girls knelt in the snow. Ellie and Grace, his daughters, were 6 years old, mirror images of one another with their round cheeks flushed red from the cold and their tangled brown hair spilling from beneath pink wool sweaters. Ellie was the quieter of the two, her face crumpled into silent sobs, clutching the edge of the coffin with both hands as if refusing to let her mother slip away. Grace, more fiery, cried out louder, her small fist pounding the snow, words tumbling incoherently through her grief. They were fragile children in that moment, not yet hardened by the world, their innocence breaking open under the weight of loss. Silas's heart wrenched at the sight, his boots stuck in the snow as if his body refused to believe what his eyes were telling him. Beside them, An older woman bent down to touch Ellie's shoulder. Louisa, Clara's longtime housemaid and confidant, her silver hair peeking from under a black bonnet, her face lined with decades of service and quiet wisdom. Louisa had known Clara since she was a child, raising her almost like a second mother, and her devotion extended naturally to the twins. "Come, little ones," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Your mother is at peace." But Ellie shook her head violently, gripping the coffin tighter, her lips trembling. "No, Mommy promised. She promised she wouldn't leave." Silas stumbled forward, his voice caught between denial and fury. No, this isn't real." His words cut through the murmurs, and heads began to turn. From the front row stepped Evelyn Harper, Clara's elder sister, tall and stern in a tailored black coat, her dark hair bound in a tight bun. Her eyes, sharp and unreadable, fixed on Silas with a composure that looked almost rehearsed. "Silas," she said, her tone clipped, "we tried to reach you, but no one knew where you were." Clara went quickly. "We couldn't wait forever." Her words were too polished, too cold for the snow that swirled between them. Silas's fists tightened, but before he could speak again, Valor growled low, a deep rumble that silenced even the whispering mourners. His amber eyes locked on the coffin, body tense, as if something within was stirring. Then, without warning, a sharp caw split the air. From the highest branch of a eucalyptus tree, a black crow swooped down, its wings cutting the wind. It circled once, then landed squarely on the coffin lid, no more than an arm's length from Ellie's bowed head. The bird stood there silently, head tilted, as if judging the crowd with its beady gaze. Gasps rippled among the mourners. An older man muttered, "Crows never come to the cemetery unless the soul hasn't left." The murmuring grew louder, people shuffling back, their breaths fogging in the air as they crossed themselves or whispered prayers. None dared approach, none dared shoo it away. Even Evelyn faltered, her lips pressed tight, eyes narrowing at the omen that now sat in the heart of the funeral. Silas stepped forward, Valor at his side, his breath harsh in the winter air. His daughters turned at last, Ellie's tear-streaked face lighting for an instant when she saw him. "Daddy," she sobbed, tugging at his coat. "Mommy's not gone. She called me last night. She said not to let them take her away." "Oyo." The words clawed at Silas's chest, dragging him deeper into the storm of dread rising within him. His gaze moved from the crow, to the coffin, to the snow swirling like ash around the grave. Something was wrong, something was unfinished. And as Valor barked once, sharp and echoing against the stones, the wind rose, tugging at the hems of coats and rattling the ropes stretched over the pit. The casket trembled. The moment the coffin trembled, the air itself seemed to stop breathing. For a second, the mourners thought it was just the wind tugging at the ropes, or the shifting of heavy wood on stone. But then it moved again, clear and undeniable, the lid knocking gently as though something trapped inside still longed for air. Silence fell so heavy that even the crows in the trees grew still. Silas Monroe's heart pounded against his ribs. He had letters, handwritten letters from Clara, less than a month old, filled with her sketches of the twins bundled in scarves. She had promised him in every word that she was waiting, enduring the winters without him. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. Then louder, his voice ragged. "Stop! Don't lower it!" The funeral workers, both middle-aged men bundled in heavy coats, froze mid-motion, their gloved hands still gripping the ropes. The crowd rippled with confused murmurs. Some crossed themselves, others looked away in fear, their boots crunching backward in the snow. Silas forced his way forward, Valor pulling hard on the leash beside him, the dog's growl low and guttural. The mourners stepped aside, not out of respect but out of unease. His broad shoulders and wild eyes made him look less like a grieving husband and more like a soldier charging into battle again. He pressed both palms on the coffin lid, feeling the tremor echo beneath his skin. Evelyn Harper's voice cut through the cold like a knife. "Silas, stop this madness." She moved toward him, her tall figure rigid with authority, her black coat flaring with each stride. Evelyn was in her late 40s, her sharp jawline softened only by the fine lines etched by years of self-control and ambition. She had been a lawyer once, a woman who wielded words like weapons in court, but since leaving the profession, She managed estates and family assets with the same iron grip. Loss had never shaken her. She seemed carved from marble, cold and unyielding. Her gaze now flashed not grief, but fury. Don't disgrace your wife's memory with theatrics. But Silas ignored her. She's alive, he said hoarsely, turning to the stunned workers. Help me open it, now. At first they hesitated. Then to everyone's surprise, Louisa Frail, silver-haired Louisa stepped forward. Do as he says, she urged, her voice trembling but resolute. I've seen her sleep as if death had claimed her before. This isn't the end. Her words, quivering with devotion, tipped the balance. The workers exchanged a glance, then unlatched the metal clasps. The moment the coffin creaked open, a chill swept out, misting the winter air. Mourners leaned forward, gasping. Inside, Clara Monroe lay pale as marble, her hair damp against her forehead, lips parted. For an agonizing heartbeat, she seemed lifeless. Then a whisper of breath escaped her throat, a faint rasp, fragile but unmistakable. Her eyelids flickered, gasps turned to cries. She's alive, someone shouted, panic spread. Some mourners scattered, clutching their coats as if death itself had been cheated and might come chasing after them. Others fell to their knees, muttering prayers in disbelief. The black crow lifted from the coffin lid, circled once overhead, then disappeared into the woods, leaving a silence heavier than its call. Silas dropped to his knees, reaching into the coffin, his gloved hands trembling as he touched Clara's face. Her skin was cold, her pulse faint, but there, beating against his fingers like a fragile drum. He bent low, whispering, Clara, I'm here. You're not leaving me. Behind him, Ellie and Grace clung to Valor's thick fur, their sobs quieting into astonishment. The dog stood rigid, blocking their small bodies from the crowd pressing forward, teeth bared at anyone who came too close. His body was a living barrier, and the twins buried their faces in his coat, whispering their mother's name as though summoning her back. Evelyn staggered back a step, her face drained of color. For a woman whose control never cracked, her hands now twitched at her sides, and her eyes darted toward the forest instead of the coffin. Impossible, she muttered under her breath, almost too low for anyone to hear. She was gone. Her mask of composure faltered for a second, revealing something raw or fear. Amid the chaos, a newcomer rushed forward from the crowd. Father Daniel Keene, the town priest, short and stout, his white hair visible beneath his wool cap, stepped quickly to Silas's side. He was in his 60s, his back slightly bent, his hands always ink-stained from the letters he wrote for parishioners who couldn't read or write. Known for kindness, he also carried a shadow in his past. Years earlier, he had buried his own daughter after a long illness, a grief that left his eyes forever weary. Kneeling beside Silas, he pressed 2 fingers against Clara's wrist, his breath catching. By God, her heart still beats. Call an ambulance, Silas roared, his soldier's voice shaking the cemetery walls. Louisa fumbled for her phone, her hands shaking so hard she nearly dropped it, but she managed to dial. The mourners whispered, their shock turning into fear of scandal, fear of miracles, fear of what could not be explained. As the distant wail of sirens began to echo through the snowy valley, Silas gathered Clara into his arms, cradling her against his chest. She stirred faintly, her lips twitching, a whisper escaping too soft to hear. He pressed his ear close, catching only fragments. His name, the girls, and something darker. Don't let them take me. The words pierced him like shrapnel. He looked up sharply at Evelyn, who stood stiff and unmoving, her face smoothed again into its practiced mask. Yet her eyes gave her away. They flickered with recognition, with something she wished had stayed buried. Valor barked once, sharp and accusing, as if he too sensed it. The ambulance arrived in a flurry of flashing red lights that painted the snow crimson. Paramedics rushed forward, young men and women bundled in navy coats, their faces tense but professional. One of them, a tall man in his early 30s with sandy blonde hair and a scar across his chin, introduced himself as Miles Turner. We'll take her from here, he said firmly, though his eyes softened as he glanced at Silas holding Clara. Miles had served briefly as a combat medic before leaving the army, And though he rarely spoke of it, his quick decisions in crisis had once saved an entire squad. It was written in the way he moved, efficient, calm under pressure, never wasting emotion. They laid Clara gently on a stretcher, wrapping her in blankets, checking her vitals. Miles frowned, his brow furrowing. Her heartbeat's faint, but steady. She shouldn't be alive after this long without proper care. Whatever happened here? He trailed off, shaking his head. As the stretcher was wheeled toward the ambulance, Ellie and Grace tried to climb after it. "Mommy, Mommy," they cried. But Valor blocked them gently, nudging them back toward Silas with his massive frame, as though reminding them their father was their anchor. Silas knelt and gathered them, kissing their foreheads, his eyes burning. "We're going with her," he told Miles. The medic nodded. Before Silas climbed into the ambulance, he glanced back at Evelyn. She stood near the grave, her gloved hands clasped tight, her face set in stone. But her eyes met his for a fraction of a second, and in that brief exchange, he saw it. Not grief, not relief, but something closer to calculation. The ambulance doors slammed shut. The siren wailed. As they sped down the snowy road, Valor curled at Silas's feet, his amber eyes never leaving Clara's pale face. The twins clung to their father's arms, whispering over and over, "She's alive, Daddy." "Mommy's alive." Yet in Silas's chest, beneath a storm of hope, another truth gnawed at him. Clara had not died naturally. Something darker had happened in the shadows of Snowbridge, and someone in that cemetery had known all along. The sirens cut through the white silence of Snowbridge, their wail bouncing off the frozen hills as the ambulance carried Clara toward St. Elora Hospital. Inside, Silas sat with his daughters pressed against him. Valor sprawled across their feet like a shield of fur and muscle. Clara's shallow breaths echoed through the cramped vehicle, every rise and fall of her chest anchoring hope to Silas's heart. He had faced death on battlefields, watched brothers fall, but never had he felt so powerless as he did now, watching the woman he loved teeter between life and shadow. The hospital loomed against the snow like a block of gray stone, its windows glowing faintly against the gloom. St. Elora had once been known as a place of refuge, a hospital where doctors prided themselves on treating patients with compassion, but in recent years its corridors had grown colder, its administration more focused on funding than care. It was here Clara would now fight for her life. The ambulance doors swung open, and paramedics rushed her into the emergency bay. Valor leapt down instantly, his claws clicking on the tile floor, his body low, his growl deep and steady, daring anyone to come too close. The orderlies hesitated, uncertain whether to push him back. Silas tightened his grip on the leash. "He stays," he said, his voice so firm that no one argued. They had seen enough in the soldier's eyes to know better than to deny him. From the trauma room, a young physician appeared. Dr. Ben Harlan, 32, with sandy hair tousled beneath a surgical cap, his brown eyes sharp behind round glasses. There was something youthful in his face, but exhaustion pulled at his features. The kind of exhaustion that comes from endless shifts. Years ago, as a timid intern, Clara had been his mentor, patiently walking him through complex cases when other senior doctors brushed him aside. He had carried her lessons in his chest ever since, and now seeing her pale, breathless form on the stretcher, his chest seized with disbelief. "Get her vitals on the monitor. Oxygen, IV fluids now," Ben barked, his voice steady with the authority Clara herself had once taught him to wield. Nurses scrambled, attaching lines, wrapping cuffs, calling out numbers. Ben's jaw clenched. Her pulse is faint but present. Whoever signed her death record made a mistake. Or worse. Silas caught that last word. His eyes locked on Ben. "What do you mean, worse?" But before Ben could answer, a nurse urged him back. "Please, sir, we need space." Reluctantly, Silas retreated to the hallway, pulling Ellie and Grace into his arms. Valor lay across the threshold of the room, his eyes fixed on the staff inside as though he were their judge. The hallway smelled of disinfectant and cold metal. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in sterile blue. Ellie tugged at her father's coat. "Daddy," she whispered. "Mommy told me in my dream she was lost in the snow, but a crow showed me where to find her." She clutched a folded paper tightly to her chest. Silas gently opened it, Crayon strokes revealed a scene. A woman lying in a white forest, a crow overhead, and behind them, a man drawn in black with no face, no eyes. Grace added softly, "He was watching us too." Silas's heart tightened. Dreams shouldn't feel like warnings, yet something in the child's trembling voice struck deeper than reason. Moments later, Louisa arrived, wrapped in her old wool coat, snow tangled in her silver hair. She pressed a bundle of papers into Silas's hands. "I found these among Clara's journals." One sheet in particular was folded more carefully than the rest. It bore Clara's handwriting. "If one day I fall unconscious, do not believe I am dead unless 3 independent tests confirm it. I've flatlined before and returned. Do not let anyone else decide for you." Silas read it twice, then looked at Louisa, his jaw hardening. She nodded. She knew Silas. She always knew her body could play tricks. Back in the trauma room, Ben steadied his hands as he adjusted the oxygen mask over Clara's face. Yet his mind spun. The chart he had been handed listed only a single pulse check, lasting less than 3 minutes. Protocol demanded 3 independent verifications over at least 10 minutes. That was no clerical oversight. It was deliberate. His gut twisted. This was malpractice or something darker. He ordered additional tests, refusing to leave Clara's side until her vitals stabilized. When at last her blood pressure ticked upward, he exhaled and stepped into the hall. Silas stood waiting, Valor at his feet, the twins clutching each other. Ben spoke quietly but firmly. "She's alive, but she's weak, and someone signed her death far too quickly." "Who?" Silas demanded. Ben hesitated. He remembered the signature, Dr. Cole, a senior attending, a man whose career was gilded with connections, not compassion. "I need to review the records further," Ben said, cautious, "but what I've seen isn't right." The elevator doors slid open with a chime. Out stepped Evelyn Harper, her black heels clicking against the tile, her expression unshaken. She approached with the precision of a predator who never wasted movement. "How is she?" she asked, her tone too flat to be genuine. Valor rose instantly, fur bristling, growling low enough to rattle the glass panes of the trauma room. Evelyn stiffened, her eyes narrowing. "Control your animal," she snapped. Silas didn't move, his gaze locked on hers. "He sees what people try to hide." Ben cleared his throat, sensing the tension. "She's stable for now, but she needs constant observation." Evelyn's lips thinned. "Then make sure she gets it. But perhaps, Silas, you should prepare yourself. Miracles rarely last." Her words hung in the sterile air, cold as the snow outside. Valor barked once, a sharp crack that made both twins cling tighter to their father. Hours later, Clara was moved to the intensive care unit. Silas sat vigil by her bed, the twins curled beside him, while Valor stretched across the door like a silent sentinel. Machines beeped softly, their rhythms fragile yet insistent, proof that life still clung to her. In the corner, Ellie took out her crayons again. She drew her mother lying on a bed, but this time the snow had crept inside, swallowing the room. Overhead, the black crow spread its wings, while in the shadows the faceless man waited. She handed it silently to her father. "He's still here," she whispered. Silas shivered, though the room was warm. In the records office, Ben sat at a computer, sweat beading his forehead. He searched for Clara's admission details. Nothing. No log time of death, no official certification, only a brief note marked "deceased prior to arrival, confirmed by Dr. Cole." Ashewam. But deeper in the system, he found something strange. A deleted entry flagged under Evelyn Harper's administrative account. His breath caught. Evelyn had access she should never have had. As midnight blanketed Snowbridge, the hospital grew quiet, its halls empty save for the shuffle of nurses and the echo of machines. Silas leaned against Clara's bed, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest. Valor rested his head on the soldier's boot, his amber eyes never straying from the woman they had saved from the earth. Silas whispered almost to himself, "You're not going back under. Not while I'm breathing." And in the shadows, somewhere deeper in St. Elora, something unseen shifted, like a secret trying to hide in plain sight. The night deepened over Snowbridge. snowflakes drifting down like pale ash, blanketing the streets and muffling the noise of the city. Inside St. Elora Hospital, the lights burned harsh and artificial, chasing shadows from sterile hallways that seemed to stretch without end. Silas sat by Clara's bedside, his daughters asleep in his arms, Valor curled at their feet. Clara's breathing was steadier now, but fragile like a candle flame, trembling in the draft of an unseen door. Silas's mind churned with unease, haunted by Clara's whispered words. "Don't let them take me." Elsewhere in the hospital, Dr. Ben Harlan leaned over a bank of old monitors in the security room. Dust clung to the wires and the computers hummed with the weary sound of machines long neglected. Beside him stood Detective Marcus Hale, a man in his late 50s with a weathered face and dark skin lined by decades of service. Hale had been called quietly by Ben after he uncovered the erased records. Tall and broad-shouldered, with gray at his temples and a limp from a bullet wound years ago, Hale carried an air of pragmatism. He had grown disillusioned after watching corruption erode trust in public institutions. But something about this case, the soldier's desperation, the children's innocence, stirred the embers of duty in him once more. Together they replayed archive footage. The grainy film stuttered, showing the third-floor ward. At 2 a.m., a man appeared in frame. He wore a white lab coat, but his ID badge was obscured. Thin, sharp-shouldered, with a narrow jaw and eyes that glinted unnervingly, even in low resolution. He carried a metal tray of medication. "Raymond Garrick," Hale muttered, recognizing the name from an old personnel file Ben had dug up. Garrick had once worked in equipment maintenance, later shifted to handling restricted medical supplies. His file contained whispers of missing anesthesia drugs, but the investigation had been buried under insufficient evidence. The footage continued. Garrick approached room 312-Clara's room. He slipped inside, re-emerging less than a minute later, tray now empty. Then another figure entered the frame. Dr. Harold Cole, the physician who had signed Clara's death certificate. Heavyset, balding, his face perpetually flushed as though from drink, Cole paused mid-hallway. He stared directly into the camera, his eyes narrowing. Then, in a deliberate motion, he reached up and switched off the hallway lights. The screen went black. Ben's knuckles whitened around the console. "That wasn't negligence," he said, his voice low. "That was collusion." Hale nodded grimly. "And if Evelyn Harper had access to the records, then this is bigger than just a reckless doctor." While Ben and Hale examined the footage, Louisa sat at home with a candle flickering on her small wooden desk. The old woman's hands trembled as she leafed through Clara's journals, worn pages filled with her careful script. One page caught her eye, half torn from the spine. On it, Clara had scribbled late at night, "Patient Raymond. Refuses food. Refuses sleep. Watches me each time I enter. Even after I leave, I feel his stare." Louisa's throat tightened. She remembered the way Clara had once confided in her about a man who made her uneasy, but Clara had laughed it off, too compassionate to push the matter further. Now Louisa knew it had not been harmless. The next morning, Silas woke to find Valor restless. The dog's ears twitched, nostrils flaring, as though catching a scent buried beneath concrete and bleach. When Silas opened the ICU door, Valor pulled hard, leading him down the corridor. Silas followed, with Ben quickly catching up. "Where's he going?" Ben asked. Silas shook his head. "He smells something." The dog led them to the abandoned third floor, long since closed to patients due to budget cuts. The stairwell creaked with disuse, cobwebs clinging to corners, the smell of mildew stronger with each step. At the landing, Valor's growl deepened. He pressed his body low, nose to the ground, and padded toward a storage room at the far end of the hall. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with chemical residue. Dust coated the floor, yet fresh scuffs marked where someone had dragged equipment. Against the wall leaned an old metal bed frame, rust creeping along its edges. On the floor beneath it, Silas noticed a dark stain. He knelt, touching it, flaking, dried blood. Nearby, half hidden beneath a pile of rags, they found a cloth soaked in a pungent chemical. Ben carefully lifted it with gloved hands, inhaling the faint sharpness of anesthetic. "This is no storage closet," he muttered. "It's a crime scene." Silas felt rage burning under his ribs. memories of combat where enemies used darkness and deception to strike. Here, in a place meant to heal, the same kind of treachery had been allowed to fester. Valor barked once, loud and echoing, as if confirming the discovery. Ben bagged the evidence, his hands shaking slightly. He had always been an idealist, believing medicine was about preserving life, not playing God. But this was betrayal by his own colleagues, and it cut deeper than he could have imagined. Raymond Garrick didn't just vanish from the system, he said. He was protected. Hale, standing in the doorway, with his trench coat pulled tight, added, "And Evelyn Harper was the one who signed his transfer papers years ago. She's not just connected, she's complicit." Later that evening, Silas sat with Clara's journal on his lap, reading her words by the dim hospital lamp, while Valor rested at his feet. Clara had written of Raymond weeks before her collapse, noting the way he appeared in wards where he didn't belong, the way his gaze lingered, unblinking. She had wondered aloud if he was more than a patient, if he was waiting for something. Silas felt a chill crawl up his spine. His wife had sensed the danger, yet no one had listened. As he closed the journal, Ellie stirred awake beside him. She handed him another crayon, drawings she had made while half asleep. This one showed their mother lying in bed, Valor at her side, while in the corner stood a man drawn in shadow, his face blank, his eyes missing. Overhead, the crow circled again. Ellie whispered, "Daddy, the man in the dark says Mommy isn't safe yet." Silas hugged her tightly, his throat thick, his soldier's instincts screaming that the battle was far from over. Snowbridge woke under a gray dawn, its rooftops bowed beneath the weight of new snow. The storm that had shadowed the town for weeks seemed to thin, as if the sky itself held its breath. In the corridors of St. Alora Hospital, Silas Monroe sat by Clara's bedside, her hand enclosed in his scarred palm. She was stronger now, her breathing steady, her color returning. Each flicker of her eyelids, each squeeze of her fingers, reminded Silas that she had clawed her way back from the grave. Valor lay at the foot of the bed, head resting on his paws, amber eyes half closed but always alert. Detective Marcus Hale had not left the hospital since the discovery of the third-floor evidence. His presence filled the room when he entered, trench coat dusted with snow, his limp forcing him into a deliberate stride. In his hand was a warrant. "It's official," he said, his voice gravelly but tinged with quiet satisfaction. "We're opening a full investigation. Evelyn Harper is at the center." The name hung in the air. Evelyn, who had moved like a shadow through the family's grief, who had orchestrated paperwork and whispers as though weaving a web. Hale explained that the forged death certificate, the deleted files, and the link to Raymond Garrick were enough to secure charges: conspiracy to commit attempted murder and insurance fraud. "Her arrest will come before sundown," he promised. Later that afternoon, Evelyn was taken from her townhouse, her black coat buttoned up to her chin, her face unreadable as officers led her into the snow. She did not fight. She did not weep. Instead, she carried herself like a woman convinced that the truth could still be bent to her will. Cameras flashed, neighbors whispered, but Evelyn stared straight ahead, her lips pressed into a line. For the first time in her life, her power had been taken from her hands. At the same time, the medical board convened an emergency hearing for Dr. Harold Cole. Heavy-set and red-faced, Cole sat trembling before the board's panel of stern faces. His voice cracked as he tried to explain, "I thought she wouldn't survive. I believed death was kinder." But the evidence spoke louder than excuses. He had bypassed protocol, silenced machines, and lent his authority to Evelyn's scheme. His medical license was revoked permanently. Some on the board muttered about criminal charges that would follow, and Cole slumped in his chair, a man undone by fear and poor judgment. Raymond Garrick was found days later, hiding in a rotting wooden cabin on the northern ridge. The structure leaned against the trees like a drunk, its roof sagging under years of snow. Inside, Raymond muttered incoherently, his thin frame hunched, his pale eyes darting. He was 40 but looked older, his skin stretched taut, his teeth stained. When police burst in, he did not fight. Instead, he pressed his hands against the wall, whispering, "I only followed orders. She told me who to put to sleep. I never chose." His words chilled the officers. echoing like the confession of a man more haunted than criminal, yet guilty nonetheless. The arrests and hearings filled the news cycle, but Silas shielded his family from the glare. For him, justice was not found in headlines, but in the simple truth of seeing Clara breathe, of hearing Ellie and Grace laugh again. Weeks passed, and Clara regained her strength. She walked slowly at first, leaning on Silas's arm, but soon she could step into the snow on her own. The twins danced around her like blossoms blooming after frost, Valor circling them with his steady, protective gait. Winter in Snowbridge brought with it an old tradition, the Lantern Festival. It was held every February when the snow was thickest and the nights were longest, a reminder that even in darkness, light could be raised to the sky. On the evening of the festival, Silas and Clara bundled the girls in thick coats and scarves, joining the townspeople in the central square. Stalls lined the streets, their lanterns glowing amber against the white night, the scent of mulled cider drifting in the air. Children laughed, snow crunched beneath boots, and for the first time in months, joy rose above grief. The Monroe family stood together, a paper lantern in their hands. Clara, her hair braided back, her cheeks pink from the cold, leaned against Silas as they wrote their wish in careful strokes. For those lost in the dark may they find the light at the end of the road. Ellie added a small drawing of a crow, wings spread wide, while Grace drew Valor beside them, his ears pricked as if guarding the lantern itself. When the signal was given, hundreds of lanterns lifted into the night sky. They floated upward in silence, golden orbs drifting against the black, each carrying prayers and memories into the heavens. The Monroe lantern rose with them, its flames steady despite the wind, and the family watched as it joined the glowing constellation. Valor sat beside the twins, his gaze fixed upward. His breath fogged the air, his ears twitching as though listening to something only he could hear. Ellie leaned into him, whispering, "You kept Mommy safe." The dog nudged her shoulder gently, his loyalty wordless but unshakable. Then above the rooftops, a shadow crossed the lanterns. A black crow soared silently, its wings stretched against the moonlight. It circled once above the square, before gliding toward the forest beyond, vanishing into the snow-laden trees. The townspeople murmured, some bowing their heads, others smiling faintly. For Silas, it was not an omen of fear, but of closure. The same bird that had landed on Clara's coffin now seemed to carry away the last fragments of darkness. Clara took his hand, squeezing it. "We've come back from death," she whispered. "Now we live." Silas kissed her knuckles, his eyes reflecting the lanterns above. "Together," he said simply. And in the heart of Snowbridge, under the watch of the mountains and the silence of the snow, a soldier, a mother, two daughters, and a loyal German shepherd stood as proof that even on the narrow edge between death and life, love could still claim victory. Sometimes the line between death and life is thinner than we think. What saved Clara was not just medicine, but love that refused to give up, a family that chose to believe when others turned away, and a loyal dog whose instincts never wavered. In the end, justice came, but even more powerful was the reminder that hope can rise like a lantern in the darkest night. If you believe that light will always find its way back, no matter how deep the shadows, share your thoughts in the comments. I would love to hear from you. And if this story touched your heart, please like this video and follow the channel so together we can keep bringing more stories of faith, courage, and love to light.